In relation, Vic, to that question of sovereignty, and you quoted that Irish Times editorial, was it, for this? Was there not an element of pious, exaggerated grandstanding in that kind of a declaration in 2011 in relation to sovereignty that conveniently ignored that sovereignty, as you've elucidated, Regine, in relation to how it was defined historically, had long been given up, and that suddenly there was this rediscovery of sovereignty and freedom that in reality had not existed for a long, long time. And a lot of people would have felt that the growing powers of the European Union was very relevant there. I mean, is that sovereignty, is that idea of sovereignty something that we need to be more sceptical about, given the extent to which we had abandoned sovereignty to a large degree? Or is that unfair?
Well, I think it's an extraordinarily rich philosophical debate. I think that you could look at this, Dermot, on a legalistic framework, and you could look at through that prism. And I think of playwrights like the great Tom Murphy, who with his plays The Wake and The House, and was always looking at the notion of tribe, nation. The fact that the notion of nation was transferable, that the Irish nation and elements of it were forced in terms of immigration to go to Coventry or London or Birmingham and indeed to Australia and the US. And I think I'm always a half full person. I think what happened with the crash, Diarmaid, and what happened was that and the emerging decade of centenaries was and I think this is what's very rich about what's happening at the moment, I think, is that there is a genuine debate, a philosophical debate around words like freedom, independence, and Regina spoke about the notion of language. But Regina, I'm a native Irish speaker, and and the notion of how to speak that and how to use that language on a daily basis is reducing. So I do think there is a sense where, in my view, and Diarmaid, you're also part of that, there is a debate around what sovereignty means. Not through a legalistic term, because we don't have our sovereignty. I mean, absolutely, Pat is quite right. The notion of having full sovereignty as a small...
So is it a feeling? Is it an emotion?
I think it could help us, it could help perhaps refresh the values that we might have as a nation, as a republic. Okay? I think we're a republic. I think the notion of republic and what that means. I mean, the notion of republic is also changed in my lifetime. Yeah. It was an extraordinarily narrow kind of definition in the 60s and 70s. I think one could be cynical about the Republican chic thing, but I actually think it's a positive thing. The notion of what we value as a nation, as a republic. What are those? Is it about actually treating all our children equally? Is it about divesting church and state truly to education? And I think what's happening at the moment is not the emotional thing. It's what are our values now? What do we think? We have an opportunity now to establish or redefine or indeed define several key values that we as a republic feel we should grow from.
On that point, Regina, can I ask you about this, because I think it's relevant. This question of school children now, because thinking about it in the early 21st century, they're being asked next March to have a proclamation day where they write a proclamation for their generation. Now again, to go back to this balancing act between cynicism and engagement with the possibilities. Is that a good idea, that a younger generation will be asked to define what freedom means to them, or are we right in saying, well, sure, why not implement the proclamation that's already there? Why do you have to write a new one for a new generation? So is that a good way forward in relation to defining freedom?
I personally think it is, because for me, I started out, actually, as it happens, as a primary teacher. So for me, I would have particular leanings towards involving children in a real contextual and conceptual level. That this is not something that is presented to them as an ideology anymore. And even with my own students in UCD, and one of my courses on the revival, one of the first things I do when I go in is I'm talking about reformulating the proclamation. One of the first things I do with them is I go to the speeches that were made, and there were three particular speeches: Douglas Hyde's speech in 1891 in New York, Douglas Hyde's speech in 1893, the necessity for the de-Anglicisation of Ireland, and Peter York's speech in 1899, the turning of the tide, which was a little bit more nationalistic. But I literally say to them, as third level students as well, and we're aware of this, to engage them, to make it real. Right, if you are looking at this in the context of revival today, and I mean, this is a cultural and Irish language course as well, and I mean, we're dying here. What are you going to do? How would you present Douglas Hyde's speech today? And what would you do? And that's one of the first exercises they have to do in the course. So I think reformulating the proclamation for children, to make them think in this. We're not talking anymore about children who don't have access to the web. I think that's a huge factor also in freedom, that even in the context of journalistic freedom today, everybody can be a journalist today on the web, be it that it's citizen journalism, but there is that concept of freedom. And that has to be regulated in a way. And if we don't start to channel that kind of thinking among children, well, then I think we're allowing textbooks and maybe a set regime to dictate to us what our education is about. And actually it goes back, if you like, to what you said as well, Pat, about Pearce's ideology of education. I mean, if he was nothing else, he was an educationalist, and his theories on education are very worth a second examination in the context of commemoration today. And I think that was one of the things that he implemented, child-centred education. But child-centred implication, moving on from the 70s to what we had at that time, but a child-centred education where they're involved in formulating their own ideology of what the 21st century will bring us. And I think we actually need to do that if we're going to, because otherwise it becomes it isn't even a manuscript, but it's a document that was 1916, and it becomes associated with a rebellion and a time that brought a lot of strife, but also a lot of growth to the country. And this makes it real to them, and I think that's.
There was that interesting OECD report recently about the role of technology in the classrooms, and the idea of all the kids having tablets and having laptops, and that was regarded as a marker of progress because we're so high tech, the high information.
But that's about transmission. I think the other myth in the culture revival that we forget, and I can only speak from reading and working with Yeats and in terms of is that they were absolutely keen on the globalized. I mean, the greatest influencers on Joyce and Yeats and Synge was Ibsen. Ibsen in Norway, and in fact, the influence, the impact Ibsen had on the Irish culture revival through the work of Joyce and Synge and Yeats was extraordinary. So we have to also break. So when we talk about technology, it's a method of transmission, but the critical inquiry, the intellectual curiosity, the sense of critical engagement. These are the tools that men and women of 100 years ago had, and I think we have it too. But I just think there's a sense, perhaps, I think in a way, I would welcome the interrogation of the proclamation, and indeed, of course, the manifesto of the 1919 government.
And of course, the proclamation, there's some extraordinary selective quotations going on. I mentioned this loosely last night, but I was at a roundtable discussion in 1916, and there was a reference to the 1916 proclamation. And one person made the extraordinary assertion that this was the most important secular document in modern Irish, if not modern European history. And I said, hold on a sec now. This document begins with the words, "in the name of God." But they wanted to focus on what they regarded as the progressive nature and the promises of equality. But that, in a way, Pat, it also brings me on to the question of religion. How relevant is religion to this, do you think, to this question of freedom now, when we consider where we are? Because there were a lot of people who would have associated freedom historically with the right to the freedom to practice their religion, and there are many who would regard the power that the Catholic Church eventually got in this state as ultimately involving an abuse of power. Does that need to come into our framework?
I think it's an interesting inversion. I think that it's now trying to see what is the appropriate space for religion in our, given all we've been through with child abuse and everything else. In effect, in this postmodern kind of cultural climate in which we live, religion is just another relativity, another one of the options that we have in the way we live our lives. And clearly, secularism is now the dominant mode of cultural expression in Ireland. The recent referendum testified to that to a very powerful extent. So I would say everything is now in a negotiable scenario. The dominant reference is not an assumed religious homogeneity, of the kind I quoted there from Pearce when he talked about freedom as a form of Catholicity. Now, of course, he meant there Catholicity in just the common sense, the small c sense of universalism. But of course, it conveniently also happened to map very conveniently on to a country that was dominantly Catholic in its imagination at the time. That's no longer true. This country is no longer dominantly Catholic in its imagination. And any attempt to construct a notion, a cohesive sense of social identity any longer, will have to be hybridized from now on. I think that's a key word we must now understand, that rebuilding Irish identity from here on is a hybrid activity. Or otherwise, we're going to end up with a whole series of subcultures that are going to feel themselves marginalized, and that in itself will have a political force, because they no longer constitute voiceless or insignificant minorities, so to speak, in the face of a dominant central cultural form of expression. I just wanted to make one comment. You said this word sovereignty, was it too emotional? I think the emotional word is the word freedom. Freedom is the emotional placeholder for vague aspiration. Sovereignty, though, is a little bit more sticky, because it does bring in this idea that it has different kinds of constitutional and institutional dimensions. And one of the most important ones, I think, is that we have a tendency to think of sovereignty at the level of the state. But there's another very important sovereignty that gets missing and is overlooked, which is individual sovereignty, which is about citizenship. And the one big thing that we need to recuperate most going forward from this moment is this idea that sovereignty doesn't inhere best in the states, it inheres in an act of citizenship. So you look at then back again to our litmus test for all of this, which is the junior cert. Yes, history is threatened, geography is threatened, who you are and where you come from is threatened, but also citizenship, civic and social responsibility as a subject on the Leaving Cert is also being demoted to being an optional extra. Yeah. So the sense that the state has a duty to cultivate a conscious sense of citizenship in the people seems to be neglected here as well. So that's a very important piece in the notion of sovereignty and ultimately whatever kind of freedom you want to realise.
There are things, Regina, though, to be very positive about, aren't there? I mean, whatever about degrees of ambiguity or certain vagueness in relation to defining freedom or its absence. If you consider, for example, the GAA, I mean, you quoted there the kind of sentiments that were being expressed by the people behind the foundation of the GAA in the late 19th century, and that has been an extraordinary success story. And could it be said that it's the kind of freedom that generates great confidence in identity? If you have a look at the success of the GAA over so many years, and then you have that sense of the Irish as being quite a crossover people when it comes to sport, because they're very secure in their freedom. They have their own native games, and yet they're very keen. Those who are interested in sport are very keen soccer players, rugby players. It's a huge weekend for sport, having come through a very successful GAA season. So is that a great success of Irish freedom?
I would think it is, and it's very fitting actually probably to bring it up this year because I know the Laois Heritage Society are involved. This was the year that Laois won the All-Ireland in the hurling. I think the only time they won it, so there's a commemoration book being published and will be launched. A little plug for the committee on the 23rd of October, and actually Paul Rouse from UCD is very involved in it as well. But so it actually, yeah, of course it is. And it's the only thing there's a lot of debate about this as well at the moment, and I think it has to be it has. I actually I'm averse to using the word inclusive because I think it has become almost a cliche at this stage. But I think we have to embrace and endorse all the other sports. And I think, for example, in 1938, when you had Douglas Hyde being ousted as patron of the GAA because of attending a soccer match, you know, those days have to be over, and and I mean, if we look actually even at the leaders of the 1916 Rising, as far as I'm aware, at least 3, if not 4 of them were rugby players, not GAA players. So I think that in that way, the GAA, of course, has done more than just sport. There's a huge community aspect to GAA, which is not really, and I don't know of any other country that takes that pride in the local aspect of helping the unity of a community. So I think that is a huge success story, and in the pride that we take in our native games, and which feeds on to, because of the ideology, if you like, as well in the GAA, it actually fed into the Gaelic League because a lot of them were in both organisations. And actually, if we look at the 1916 Rising, also a lot of the some of the battalions that were involved, 85% I believe, were GAA and Gaelic League members. So it has fed through, but this also goes back to religion as well, Pat, that it was never, and the GAA, it was never a prerequisite to be a Catholic or to be a Protestant or to be affiliated to any particular religion. The premise on which those all 3 organisations that I mentioned were founded was on the premise that they would be embracing of all cultures and all creeds and all of all people, and that was one of their strengths. I think we have to be very, very careful moving forward that does not become that the rock that these organisations will be judged upon will not be the Irishness as much as their openness to all cultures that are now on this island. And I think sport is one of the wonderful ways to do it. And of course, we saw it with the soccer game the last night, a taste of Italia 90. And we can be funny about that, and we can treat it lightly. But Italia 90 was a huge cornerstone in this country, in the morale that it provided. And sport does that for them. I mean, people are heading off this weekend. You know, they're heading to rugby, they're heading to soccer, and the GAA. I mean, there'd be GAA on a constant basis going on. So I do think, as we said, maybe going back to that, you know, in the Cultural Revolution in, you know, the 1860s and that, where we do embrace our sport, our dancing, our music, and our language. And I think they are things that we should be proud of, and that they are probably symbols of maybe symbols of Irish freedom, but again, they're words we have to be very, very careful in using.
And I think you would have seen that at the Abbey over the years as well. There was reference there made to different cultures, changing cultures, and the amount of people who came to Ireland seeking freedom. And of course, there are those who still want to come to Ireland to seek freedom. And I remember looking at the production. It was Bitsy Adigun, wasn't it, a Nigerian playwright, who wanted to stage his version of what we would regard as classic, classic Irish plays from that era. But even this whole idea that, you know, if you want to understand what somebody who had come to Ireland during that period was going through, well, then you go and see a play by Jimmy Murphy about Kilburn Road, or, you know, that these are not just Irish experiences. Is there much more of a sense of that in the world of arts now?
There is. I mean, I think the kind of the vision of the founders of the Abbey was always to hold a mirror up to our society. So this is constantly one of the drivers I have in programming. And it's not a plug for the Abbey at the moment, but if you come to the Abbey, say today, and see 2 different plays, one is a play that's 2,500 years old, which is Sophocles' Oedipus, which is positioned in a new version by Wayne Jordan, which, funny enough, and Oedipus, as we know, is about Oedipus and Creon and Jocasta, but actually what Wayne has done is put the focus on the chorus as the elemental and central part, and the citizens, and that the citizens themselves have a responsibility and have to act on it, whether it's about how you vote, and what the consequences of how you vote, or how you articulate that vote, or how you treat and deal with the leaders of the time. And that production has is beginning of our interrogation of the legacy of 1916. But in the Peacock, which is, and we talk about new communities, we also talk about issues at the moment. Peacock, 160 miles from here, is some of the most extraordinarily perverse institutionalization of segregation happening in any part of the world, which is the peace walls of Belfast. There are more peace walls being built, or interface barriers being built in the city of Belfast since the Good Friday Agreement than before. And concrete, enormous walls are being built, institutionalizing segregation of two communities. And a young Protestant loyalist writer by the name of Stacey Gregg from the Dundonald outside Belfast has written a play that we've put on. In other words, we as the Abbey have to engage and listen to the playwright. So while we talk about freedom, while we talk about secularism, there is not that far away from us, an hour and a half's drive from here, a generation, a younger generation of children are being, the notion of integration is not actually taking hold in Belfast.
And isn't one of the reasons...
And that's a key concern.
But isn't one of the reasons for that as well, that we can talk about freedom, but for many people, there isn't that freedom. You know, when they think of Ireland and freedom, they think of an Ireland that's not partitioned. Yeah. You know, so you're looking at...
And it's no accident that both Stacey Gregg and we have a new play by David Ireland next year, that these writers of that, and they're both from the same estate, are coming down to Dublin to put the plays on here so that it projects back up and across. And that's an interesting, that actually, and that's our challenge, of course, always to listen to that.